Welcome to the University of San Francisco Nobel Prize Lecture Series. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I think this is more for sure of a behavioral science cosmic experience than looking up at the sun or the moon tonight. I just wanted to make sure that there's going to be a lot of people that said, well, where were you? I was at the eclipse, and then you could say, no, I was listening to a legend in behavioral finance. My name is Jeff Silk, and I am a graduate of the University of San Francisco. I'm part of the Board of Trustees. I would be the board chairman of our academic affairs here at the University of San Francisco. My wife, Naomi, who's sitting right there. Naomi, stand up for a quick sec. My wife, Naomi, and I founded the University of San Francisco Investment Institute. And let me just take a quick sec to tell you about the Investment Institute. Part of the Institute is our Student Investment Club is part of the Institute. We have the president of the Investment Club someplace. Where's Christopher? Christopher's running around here someplace helping out. Thank you, Christopher. Also part of the Investment Institute is a financial literacy program that we created for the underserved areas of San Francisco. And it's the Investment Institute, and we're creating the curriculum and then training our students from our School of Education to go out and teach these financial literacy programs to the underserved parts of San Francisco. We have created an investment minor. So we think we've created the only investment minor in the country here at USF that it doesn't matter what degree, if you're an economics degree or if you're a psychology degree, you can get an investment minor. And our hope is that we spread the love and the word of investing to our students here at the University of San Francisco. But ultimately, through the Investment Institute that we've created, we are hopeful that more students will get involved in the world of investing, that when our students graduate, that they'll be ready, up and running to go to work for an investment company and to build a career in the investment business. Tonight, Professor Dr. Ludwig Kincarini, who is going to be interviewing our speaker, and we'll introduce our speaker, is the head of the University of San Francisco Investment Institute. And I personally want to thank you for all of the time, effort, and work that you've put into making all this stuff such a successful event. So with that being said, I'd love to be able to introduce the Executive Director of the USF Investment Institute, Professor Dr. Ludwig Kincarini.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Just to give you an idea, we've asked Richard to speak for 40 minutes, and then we're going to do this long Q&A. But we don't know if it will end in 40 minutes, so you have to remember that. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I would like to thank Linda Wong, the staff of USF, Sam Bethel, and all the students who volunteered to help out. I'd like to thank Dean Odko for all her support. And most importantly, I'd like to thank Jeff Silk, Naomi Silk, and the Silk family for continuing to contribute to the University of San Francisco. Thank you. Two more things, and tonight we're doing something differently. Rather than me telling you about our guest speaker, which is immensely boring, we're going to put a video up that we did for him. I was actually Richard Thaler's TA or RA in graduate school, but he doesn't remember it, and I don't even remember it, and I don't know what that means. But I think I remember what he told me, which was follow me and listen, and hopefully I did some of that. So without further ado, we're going to put up our video.
You are probably wondering why there is a bowl of cashews on your program cover. Thaler believes he started wondering about human behavior in graduate school, when people who could choose whether or not to eat more cashews before dinner told him that they were happier when he removed the bowl of cashews. He realized that more choices don't always help people, because sometimes they have self-control problems. His thoughts were vague and scattered until he came across the work of Kahneman and Tversky. These two psychologists had documented and proposed a simple framework for dealing with how humans made decisions that were not always rational. Thaler ran with this idea and used the Kahneman and Tversky models in all kinds of places. He is often credited with coining the term the endowment effect. This is an effect that has been documented in experimental settings, whereby people will ask more to give up an item than they will pay to acquire it. Humans also like rules of thumb, often based on the availability of the information. If I ask you, what is the percent of all gun deaths that were murders versus suicides last year, what are you thinking? In fact, in any typical year, there are more gun deaths by suicide than by murder. Why did you get the answer wrong? You are biased because murders are more publicized than suicides. Thus, it's more available in your memory. Thaler is probably most well known for his best-selling book, Nudge, which discusses how decisions may be influenced by the way in which they are presented. The concept of nudge was the popularized version of work by psychologists like Iyengar and Lipper's work on Too Many Choices and Kahneman and Tversky's framing effect. The idea that too many choices might demotivate human beings, and that an individual's choice from a set of options is influenced more by how the information is worded than by the information itself. Thaler received the Nobel Prize in 2017 for his contributions to behavioral economics. Richard Thaler was born on September 12, 1945 in New Jersey. He graduated with an economics degree from Case Western Reserve University and completed both his master's degree and PhD from the University of Rochester. He has been a professor at Rochester, Cornell, and the University of Chicago. He is currently the Charles Walgreen Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics at the University of Chicago. Today, he will discuss economics in the 21st century and highlights from his career. And then there will be a Q&A session with Dr. Ludwig Kincarini with audience interaction. Would you please give a warm welcome to Professor Richard Thaler.
What I want to talk about today is what is behavioral economics and how it differs from mainstream economics. And mainstream economics is based on two assumptions about how people make decisions. And the first is that people choose by optimizing. So if you look at an economic model, you'll see somewhere maximize, max dot. And it means people choose the best. And they do that for any problem, regardless of how hard it is, regardless of whether they've ever seen it before. That's how they choose. The second assumption is that when making forecasts or judgments, they make judgments that are unbiased. So we had the example of gun deaths by homicide versus suicide. That's an exception to that. So then we add, that is, the first bullets are all of economic theory of the individual. They do what's smart. What makes it into economics is to add markets. So we have these people, these very smart people who think like they have, they're running regressions in their heads. And then they interact in markets that work really well. So that's a story. It's a nice story. It's a world that might be kind of boring to live in. but it's certainly not the world we live in. So I've spent the last 40 years or so being the guy who's pointing at various body parts on the emperor, and rather than describing his imaginary clothes. And I'll give you a few examples of how that's worked. So we've already heard the story about the cashews. This is kind of the beginning. I had some friends, from graduate student friends over, other economists, put out a bowl of cashews and possibly an adult beverage. And people started gobbling up the cashews. And at some point, I was worried about our appetites. And so I went and removed them and hid them in the kitchen, nibbling a few more as I went along. And I came back, and everybody said, "Thank God you got rid of those cashews, because we were not going to stop eating." But then, since they were economics graduate students, we launched into another conversation, which is, well, how can it be that we're happy? That we're not allowed to be happy because we have fewer choices now than before. Before, we could eat as many cashews as we want. Now, we'd have to go find them in the kitchen, and that would be rude. So we're not allowed to be happy, but we are happy. What's going on? And that got me thinking about self-control problems. And if you read an economics textbook, the phrase self-control never appears. So it's not like there's a line in an economics textbook that says, we assume that people have no self-control problems, right? In fact, it would be kind of amusing to have such an obviously false statement. You know, at least since Adam and Eve, people have had self-control problems. But economists like using the phrase as if. So we have models that are as if people have no self-control problems. Why? Well, remember, they're maximizing. So they're going to eat exactly the right number of cashew nuts, have exactly the right number of drinks, and, well, they're not human if they do that. If you're looking for a gift for my birthday, this bottle would be a good one. I had a professor when I was a grad student at the University of Rochester, chairman of the economics department, who was a wine lover. And he had, like many wine lovers, been buying this is a Bordeaux wine, and he had been buying them for years, and he had some that had appreciated greatly in value. So let's say he bought a bottle for $5, it was now worth $100. And he would say, well, I'll never pay more than $30 for a bottle of wine. But he would sometimes drink one of his $100 bottles. And there was a guy who ran a liquor store in Rochester, wine shop, who offered to buy those bottles at retail. We'll ignore the bid-ask spread here. And so what do we have here? He won't buy a $100 bottle of wine, and he won't sell his $100 bottle of wine, but he'll drink a $100 bottle of wine. Right? So yeah, that's not consistent with optimization. This is what we call the endowment effect. You like what you have, and you don't want to give it up, but you wouldn't pay that much to get it if it went away. Here's another story from my graduate student days. I had a friend named Jeffrey, and this was when Buffalo had a professional basketball team, and somebody gave us tickets to go see a basketball game, which all of you are missing. I hope you're taping or something tonight. And then there was a big snowstorm, and normally it's an hour and 15-minute drive from Rochester to Buffalo, but not in a blizzard. And so Jeffrey calls me and says, well, no, we're not going. It'd be crazy to go, he says. But if we had paid for those tickets, we would go. And I said, don't you know the term sunk cost? So he hadn't. But so again, this is violating economic theory. It shouldn't matter at all how much we paid for the tickets. Our decision is the utility of going to the game greater than the cost of driving back and forth in a blizzard? And what we paid for the tickets doesn't matter. So that led to kind of a very long interest I've had in what I call mental accounting. You can think about mental accounting as what's going on in Jeffrey's head. Why does he think that if, let's suppose we had paid $50 each for those, that would be a lot of money back then. But anyway, so we had paid $100 for these tickets. How does going to the game help? So that's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I should say all of these questions were impolite questions. And my professors, I would go talk to one of them and they'd say, go back to, punch cards and running regressions and things like that. So then somebody told me about the research of these guys. That's Amos Tversky on the left and Danny Kahneman on the right. And I had never heard of them. Essentially, no economist had ever heard of them. They were pretty famous in psychology already, and they were in the process of, we're now in the 1970s, and they were writing a series of papers on how people make judgments, and the availability heuristic example that Ludwig gave, the introduction gave, was an example of a judgment mistake. And so somebody said, hey, you should look at these papers. And I went and read the papers. And, you read about people having an aha moment. That was an aha moment for me. And the reason was that economists, even then, would have been happy to admit that most of the people they know are actually kind of dumb. And if you ask them about, say, their students, or their dean, or whoever's president at the time, or their spouse, basically they think they're all idiots, but their papers are about these fictional creatures that do everything right. So, just explaining to your colleagues, look, you are always making fun of everybody else. That wasn't good enough. You had to have something that would upset their model. And the thing that I got from them was the idea of a systematic bias, right? So take the homicide and suicide example. That's a predictable error, right? We could have asked dozens of questions of all of you before we started and predicted what your answers would be, and they would be different from the correct answers. Okay, that's interesting. And that aha moment kind of got me started. And then prospect theory, which was also mentioned in the introduction, that little graph that was shown, the prospect theory value function, I had a picture of that graph on my wall for a long time, and there was just so much about human nature just in that graph. So I decided, they were professors at Hebrew University, and they were coming to Stanford for a year on a sabbatical, and I decided to stalk them. And so I went to Stanford and begged and pleaded, and a guy called Victor Fuchs, father of health economics, took pity on me and put me on his grant. And I spent the year talking to these two. That's about what they looked like at the time. I was younger and hairier. So it was what I learned from them that gave me the courage to say, oh, well, maybe I could do something with this. And now that was an aspiration to do what we now call behavioral economics. But I had no idea what to do. I mean, making fun of your colleagues is fun. Making fun of their models is also fun. But it was hard to see how that was going to lead to a job, especially when the people that you're making fun of are the ones that hire you. One thing you can learn from those little stories, those stories are my origin story. But can you test economic theory? One way you can test it is that, a quick aside, I mean, economic theory very rarely makes predictions about magnitudes. Normally, the predictions are about just the sign. So, like demand curves slope down. If the price goes up, people buy less. The theory says that. It doesn't say by how much, right? And a lot of so-called tests of economic theory just are about getting the sign right. That, oh yeah, look, the price went up and people bought less. See, we're right. No. So there are some situations where economic theory makes more precise predictions. And those are cases where the theory says there will be some variable that doesn't matter at all. I call these supposedly irrelevant factors, or SIFs, right? And if you go back through my little stories, they're all SIFs. The location, there's cashews right over there. I don't know whether they're real ones, but it shouldn't be that I'll eat more of them when we go sit over there than right now, right? I could go get one. The wine, it shouldn't matter whether the bottle of wine is in Professor Rosette's wine cellar or at the wine shop. The opportunity cost is $100. Why is he willing to drink it if he has it, but not be willing to buy one? The sunk costs, you know, if you've taken an economics course, you've heard the term sunk costs. Economists are fond of explaining to their students you should ignore sunk costs, and not remotely embarrassed about the fact that their theory assumes that the students already do. So, but once we realize that there are these SIFs that matter, then a lot of things become possible to explain and maybe even possible to influence. Let's take the case of willpower. You know, what happens if some people are tempted and then do things that they didn't intend to do and later regret? Well, let's consider the economic theory of savings. And Franco Modigliani won the Nobel Prize for this theory. And what is the theory? It is that, you know, let's take the students in the room. You figure out how much you're going to earn over your lifetime and how long you're going to live. Then you figure out the optimal consumption path. Let's simplify and say you want to spend the same amount every year or whatever. And now you solve. Now you better have had that investments course, right? Because part of this is predicting how much you're going to make on your investments. And it would help to know a lot about life expectancy. And anyway, you can see this is a really hard problem. In economics, does anybody add how hard is the problem to the description of the theory? Certainly Modigliani doesn't mention it. I only know one economist who I think has probably solved this. It's a guy called Doug Diamond at the University of Chicago. He's the guy I go to for financial advice. And if there's anybody, another friend of mine, David Laibson, claimed that he had come close to solving this. And then he got married, and I asked him what he thought was the probability of divorce and whether he had incorporated that into the model. And then he conceded that, okay, I was right. So David is a brilliant guy. If this problem is too hard for David, it's too hard for anybody, right? So, okay, what are we going to do? You know, for most of the time humans have been on Earth, this is not a problem that anybody had to solve because you would die, right? So you didn't have to worry about old age. Nature, you know, a lion came and ate you. But those that did live a long time, if they were lucky enough to have a family, the family would take care of them. And that was the retirement saving plan for the first few million years that we were here. Then 20th century comes along, people start moving away from their kids, living longer, and not saving. And so what happens? Well, institutions develop. Governments start Social Security programs. The Germans had the first one. Companies start defined benefit pension plans. And both of those, Social Security and defined benefit pension plans, require no decisions on the part of the worker. You just work, you accumulate benefits, and then you retire, and you get an annuity. Easy. Social Security is the same way. Well, then we got this new innovation of defined contribution plans like 401ks. Those are hard. You have to join. You got to figure out how much to save. You got to figure out how to invest. This is back to the real world, right? And some people didn't join. 401ks, a lot of people in this room won't realize that they're new. I think they were 1986, something like that. There were 401k. Why is it that weird name? It's provision in some law. And there was some paragraph that somebody figured out, hey, I could use that to create this tax-free way of savings. And that's why we have those things now. But some people failed to join. Even the ones who joined, they would often save too little. They did a lousy job of investing. Can we do anything to help them? Well, notice economic theory has nothing to advise us about this. Say, I go to Doug Diamond and I say, how could we help people save for retirement better? Well, he'll say, no, they're saving optimally. There's nothing for us to do, right? So can behavioral economics help? Yes. So some of you got a copy of my book with Cass Sunstein called Nudge. The idea of Nudge was if we arrange the choice environment in a clever way, we can make life easier for people even in hard domains. So choice architecture is like you go to a restaurant, there's a menu. Somebody created the menu. There are a lot of degrees of freedom. Are salads a separate category? What about soups? Even within the entrees, are the fish and meat courses separate? If you're in an Italian restaurant, the pasta's its own category. Italians think pasta deserves its own category. Store layouts. You go into a supermarket, it's not an accident that the milk is in the back, because everybody buys milk and they want you to walk all the way through the store to get there and pass by lots of tempting stuff to buy that has high profit margins. And places like Amazon, they know a lot about this. So choice architecture is a world designed for humans rather than econs, which is what Cass and I call the imaginary creatures in economics textbooks. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is change the default. The default is what happens if you do nothing. And humans are really good at doing nothing. So, if you're watching television and you finish some show, if it's on traditional television, the next show comes on. Well, that's a clever strategy. So even places like Netflix adopt the same thing. Next show starts. So the default is to keep watching. Well, if the default is to do nothing, then we can make retirement plans work better by making joining the default. So the old default was you had to fill out a bunch of forms to join. We said, hey, how about we switch it? We tell people, we're going to enroll you unless you fill out a form saying you don't want it. Bingo, 90% of the people join. Even as we go down rich guys figure out that they should take tax-free savings, especially if their employer's giving them a match. The lower paid workers need some help. Well, another problem was with automatic enrollment, the default was too low, often 3%. So a student of mine and I created a solution to this that we called Save More Tomorrow. And the idea was you say to people, hey, you want to join a plan where we increase your saving rate every year when you get a raise? And that also works. I'm going to just go to a table. This is the first company we convinced to try this. They were given some financial advice, and some people just said no, they didn't want the advice. The people on the pink line, or whatever that color is, were lousy savers, but then we increased their saving rate 3% a year, and you can see, boom, we made them into super savers. So, few remarks about financial markets, and then I have a good idea that Ludwig and I will continue this conversation. Finance has two components. The efficient market hypothesis, which my golf buddy Gene Fama created, and it has two components. What does it mean for markets to be efficient? One is, I call the no free lunch component, which is it's hard to beat the market. The second component I call the price is right. And it's the idea that stock prices reflect the correct value of the security. And my grades for these two, I give the no free lunch component an A-. It's not impossible to beat the market, but it's hard. And maybe the best evidence for that is, first was a thesis written by Michael Jensen, who passed away last week, I think. His thesis at the University of Chicago showed that, on average, actively managed mutual funds don't beat the benchmarks. So if it was easy to beat the market, you would think the pros would do it. But on average, they didn't back in 1968, and there have been hundreds of replications of this since. What about, is the price right? That's harder to test because most of the time you don't know what the right price is. But with my friend Owen Lamont, who was a colleague of mine at Chicago, we've made it a business to go look for violations of this. And here's one. Here's another one. There's a kind of mutual fund called a closed-end fund. And what makes those special is a regular mutual fund, you put your money in and they buy you securities. And then if you want to take your money out, they give you back the value of the securities you own. And everything is done at what they call net asset value, which is the value of the securities they own. Now, there's one of these funds called, it has the ticker symbol CUBA, Caribbean Basin Fund, I think it's called. And you can see, like most closed-end funds, it's trading at a discount. You see the blue line is the market price. And for the first part of this chart, it's trading at about a 10% discount. And then, ooh, see that jump? Goes to, I think, 70% premium. What happened? Any guesses? Well, that was the day that President Obama announced his intention to relax relations with Cuba. Now, the Cuba Fund does not invest in Cuba, right? A, there are no securities in Cuba. B, if they were, it would be illegal for an American company to invest in them. So this is just ticker confusion, okay? And it's stupid, okay? So prices can be wrong. It can be hard to show it, but there are lots of examples. You know, there are many going on right now. One is President Trump's company, which appears to be worth zero and was last week trading for $90. It's lost about half its value in the past week. Regardless of whatever you think of Donald Trump, that company is overvalued. But there's no way to make money on this, because if you wanted to sell it short, brokers would charge you 500% interest to borrow the shares. So the last line of this is maybe the most important one. Prices can be wrong, but it doesn't mean you can make money. So there are lots of things, like I thought Bitcoin was stupid from the beginning, and I got wronger and wronger. So you can be wrong and go broke, even if you were kind of right or not right. So this is the end of my talk with 3 conclusions. First of all, it's possible to do economics even without this imaginary creature of the econ. Understanding human nature helps. It helps improve the explanatory power of economics, and sometimes we can help people make better decisions. We can nudge for good. Okay, the next slide, I'm not going to talk. I will leave this up for future conversations.
Thanks for waiting, and that was a great lecture. The other thing that I was amazed at is that Richard actually kept to the time, which is record-breaking. I've never seen anyone do that, so thank you for that as well. So we're going to start with some general questions, and then we're opening it to the audience for questions. First question is, what is the biggest lesson you have learned in your career about economics?
Supply equals demand. If you want a more serious answer, I would say let me answer a slightly different question, which is, I think the biggest lesson from behavioral economics about how I think economics should be done is we need to distinguish between normative models and descriptive models. By normative, I mean any of those models that start with somebody maximizing. It's normative in the sense that it's what economists think is the smart thing to do, like that life cycle model. And that's really good advice. I would teach my kids that you ought to think about that as a way of thinking about that problem. But it's a really terrible model of what people do. And if we're going to have models that have more explanatory power, I always say behavioral economics is just economics with a higher R square. And the way to get the higher R square is to make it about predicting what real people do.
Okay, thank you. You won the Nobel Prize for your work in behavioral economics. You sort of already did describe the early days, but can you describe anything else about those early days? And how did people react to you at first? Were you dismissed? How did you feel those early days were?
Well, I would say 99.9% of the economics profession either ignored me, or if they had the bad luck to actually meet me, they just thought I was wrong. So there were maybe a dozen people that thought this was interesting. It was encouraging that those people tended to be really smart. Mm-hmm. Kenneth Arrow, Tom Schelling, Bob Solow. And there were some psychologists, not just Kahneman and Tversky, that were encouraging, but basically the paper that the Nobel Prize Committee cites as sort of starting it all is a paper I published in 1980. It got rejected at every major economics journal. I finally published it in a journal that was just starting, and they were desperate for papers. I had better luck in finance, but partly because I hacked the system. So my first finance paper with Werner de Bont, was on the program at the American Finance Association meeting. And at that time, one paper from each session could be included in the journal. And the papers were picked by the president of the American Finance Association. And in 1985, the president was Fisher Black. And he had kind of a renegade streak. Mm-hmm. And so, oh yeah, I like that paper. And then we wrote another paper, and we used the same trick. And Richard Roll said he published that paper. Then after that, we had stirred up so much trouble at the University of Chicago, where all the grad students were given the assignment of finding de Bont's programming error. Then it became easy to publish finance papers. It never became easy to publish economics papers.
Okay, thank you. Speaking about finance, there are tons of skeptics in behavioral economics. Let me mention a few. One Nobel Prize winner that I won't mention his name said, "I can't believe in a theory that says you can make money because people continue to be dumb or continue to repeat the same mistakes without learning." Another person...
Well, let's just stop with that. In fact, So I got advance notice of these questions, fortunately. And I think the way you phrased it is there was somebody who kept telling you, and then...
That's true, yes.
Right? So notice he was doing exactly what he didn't think anybody would do, which is keep making the same mistake over and over again. And there are some subtleties there. First is, do people learn? He says, why don't they learn? So my friend Danny Kahneman and I ran the following experiment. This is one of many papers we didn't write. We had two envelopes with poker chips numbered 1 through 20. And one of the envelopes was labeled heads, and one was labeled tails. And then students in my MBA class had a form with 2 rows, one labeled heads, one labeled tails. And the rules were they could circle any 5 numbers, 1 to 20, 1 to 20. So heads 3, heads 7, tails 9, like that, right? And the rules were, if you had circled the then I would flip a coin, take a number from the designated envelope. If you had circled it, you would get $3 if it was a head and $2 if it was a tail. Now, what is the smart thing to do here? Obviously, you should only circle heads, right? So about half of the students always circled heads, circled only heads. The other half, most of them did 3 and 2. They diversified. Okay, now this was an experiment about learning. So we did that, then we repeated it. And we did it 10 times with feedback. So we'd go, it's heads 3. Did anybody circle that? They would raise their hand. We'd go give them $3. And then we do it again. How many people learned after 10 of these trials? 1. And he was counteracted by somebody who had been only circling heads and switched. So learning is not so easy. And this was an evil experiment. Why? Because we were giving them feedback, but it wasn't the right kind of feedback. Because half the time it came up tails. And you circled all heads. Damn, I've already lost. He hasn't even pulled a number out, right? So learning is not so easy.
Okay, thanks. That was a great experiment. Let's see what else we have. So another criticism that people might have is behavioral economists are critics. They're criticizing everything around them, but they're not building anything, or they're not innovating. So I'm going to give you an example, and I'm setting you up because I know you're going to use this. The CAPM. A lot of people use the CAPM. It has its flaws, but at least people can use it. Can you comment on these criticisms that the behavioral economists or they don't give us a recipe?
Well, I would say 2 things. One, there is prospect theory, and every test of prospect theory against expected utility theory with real data, prospect theory wins. It's undefeated. So now, as for the CAPM, does everybody know what that is? So this is capital asset pricing model, and it's a normative theory. It says, and I believe, a lot of my finance colleagues disagree with this, but I believe in a world of econs, it would be true. And what it says is that you don't get paid for bearing risk unless the risk is systematic. And so, you measure the risk of a stock by how correlated it is with the market. And that correlation is called beta. Now, there's a slight problem with this theory, which is that according to the theory, stocks with high betas earn high returns because they're risky. And stocks with low beta have low returns because they're safe. The opposite is true. In fact, some hedge funds have strategies based on buying low beta stocks to get high returns. So It's like you have a theory of gravity that things go up. Would you use that to form corporate policy? I wouldn't. I'd prefer a theory of apples falling down than apples falling up. Now, what do they use beta for? They use it for investment decisions. And that's why I left this chart up here. And I now remember something I got you to do at MIT.
Okay.
This is another thing Kahneman and I did. So Kahneman had a theory that firms make bold forecasts and timid choices. So I assigned my MIT MBA students, I said, your job is to go find somebody with a real job that knows someone, knows about a project that their firm adopted, investment project, that was analyzed, and something recent. They all submitted their answers. What did they find? We asked them for these projects, what's the expected rate of return on this project? The median was about 35%. What was the required rate of return, the hurdle rate? 15 to 20%. What's the chance this project will succeed? Median was 0.9. Right? Now, they're using this hurdle rate. Why are they having such a high hurdle rate? This is a chart of historically what CFOs have reported as their hurdle rate. Now, the thing to notice is it's basically a constant. It's the top blue line. It's been about 18%. The whole period when interest rates are falling and their cost of capital is presumably falling, they can borrow like at 3%. They're still saying, we got to have 17% rate of return in order to fund an investment. That's what our students reported. This is from John Graham in his presidential address to the AFA. Now, this is an example of heuristics and biases. If you ask firms why are they doing this, they'll give you an answer that's kind of sensible. They'll say, well, the people that are pushing projects are basically lying or exaggerating. Right, our students found that. 37% rate of return, great. I mean, if I could have had the returns that my students reported were about to get with a 90% chance, I would have been a very rich man. So they say, well, we have to have a high hurdle rate because they lie about the returns. But notice that creates a bias, and it's a bias against projects that are long. And I think, so, I mean, using beta to estimate what the required rate of return is, I think it's pretty stupid. Now, it's based on a theory, an elegant theory that happens to be wrong, but I wouldn't use that as a justification. And I have some colleagues who've been finding that if you find companies that are doing something sensible instead, those are good investments.
Okay, thank you. So this is very convenient. For those who don't know, the inventor of the CAPM is William Sharpe, who also won the Nobel Prize. There were some other guys too, but he won the Nobel Prize. And my next question comes from William Sharpe.
Okay, great.
So first I have to give you some background. So a lot of robo-advisors and financial advisors in the United States use questionnaires as a method to figure out what your risk tolerance is, to figure out how much risk you should take versus return. So this is pretty much the state of the industry. So here's the question from William F. Sharpe. Quote, I remember spending some time with Richard Thaler when he was at Stanford many years ago. We were chatting one morning when I asked him what he thought of questionnaires that purported to measure risk tolerance by asking questions such as, quote, "Would you like to parachute from a plane?" He replied something to the effect of, "I think they are worthless." Has your opinion changed on this matter? That's his question.
Not at all. And I may answer all these questions by quoting a story about Danny Kahneman. He and I had a consulting job for a while with Ibbotson and Associates. And it was to create a better version of this. And they gave us a retainer. That seemed like a lot of money at the time. And they would bring us in and show us their latest ideas for doing this, and we would trash it. It was a very painful experience for them. And then they would not invite us back, but continue to pay us until somebody, like a couple of years later, said, "Hey, we're still paying these guys." So they would bring us back and, repeat the same thing. So no, I don't know of any evidence that any such questionnaires predict anything useful.
Okay, thanks. So here comes a question about something that we all deal with and related to anomalies, efficient markets. One of the things that I was stunned about when there was smoking, remember when there was smoking in cafes? I couldn't believe that there wasn't a bar who just said, "No smoking here," because I hated the smell on my clothing and stuff like that. And I always wondered why private markets did not adjust. Today, there's cell phones, and there are a lot of people who believe that cell phones are hurting the development of children, and some people are arguing that there should be regulation, including no smartphones before high school, no social media until you're 18 years old, no cell phones while you're at school, and blah, blah, blah. Do you think that this is a problem, and do you think there should be some kind of restriction on cell phones?
So, the smoking example, it's not surprising that cigarette companies didn't solve this, right? If you manufacture pollution, you keep doing it until somebody tells you to stop. Now, it is interesting that there weren't non-smoking bars, and I think it was a mistake. Mm-hmm. But no, the people who owned bars and restaurants fought like hell for rules that banned smoking. And, like 5 years later, everybody said, "God, remember the horrible days when restaurants were full of smoke, or there'd be a smoking section." Believe it or not, kids, you used to be able to smoke in the back of the plane. Right? It was one plane, right? There wasn't even a wall. So I think some airlines banned smoking on their own, but most of them waited for the government to tell them they had to do it. So Facebook is not gonna, or, Meta is not gonna do something. Whether we should or not, Cass and I prefer libertarian paternalism, so I wouldn't ban Facebook, but I would certainly give parents tools that would allow them to exert parental influence. Mm-hmm. And but we shouldn't go down this path, but because I don't claim to know anything about it, but there will be similar discussions about AI, and I think all I'll say is I don't think that there's any way to regulate that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not an expert in it.
Okay, thanks. So
might as well stick to things I think I know something about.
Maybe find a nudge, though, for the cell phones. Okay, a few more questions, and then we'll open it to audience. How did your life change after winning the Nobel Prize, and what is the coolest thing that happened because of it?
Well, the answer to the latter is I got an invitation to play Augusta.
Oh, wow. And you can't tell us how that happened, who it was? No.
Oh, no, I can tell you how it happened. There was a guy who came to write an article about Gene Fama, Steve Levitt, and me. We all played the same golf course in Chicago. And it was right after I won the Nobel. And he knew we were all playing there. And at the end of he played golf with us, and at the end, we went to the 19th hole, and he said, is there any question I should have asked? And I said, well, you could have asked if there's some golf course I want to play. I said, okay. And I gave the correct answer. And about 9 months later, I got a phone call.
That's great. And so is it all it's cracked up to be?
Better.
Yeah. How was 12? Did you get on?
I had, I will say I had nightmares for months before. And the 3 other people I was playing with, I invited Fama as my guest.
Wow.
And the first 3 hit it into the water. I took an extra club and hit it into the bunker behind.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So.
Okay, awesome.
And then otherwise, no, I don't think my life has changed very much. Certainly not at the University of Chicago, where there are 3 other Nobel Prize winners on my floor. So, what have you done for me lately?
What's something that you learned from a family member that has helped you in your career?
My father was an actuary. And I learned I didn't want to do that. And not only because being an actuary is kind of boring, but he worked for Prudential, so a big company, and I kind of saw what that life was. And like at 18, I had enough self-insight to realize I was a lousy subordinate. And I have a long string of deans who will confirm that self-assessment. So being an academic is more like being self-employed.
It is, yeah.
And so I learned not to be an actuary.
And out of all your accomplishments, what are you most proud of and why?
I'm proud of the team building that I and others did in starting this field. One guy waving at windmills was not going to do anything. I needed to recruit. I always said I never changed anybody's mind. I just corrupted the youth. And so the Russell Sage Foundation, which supported us early on, at some point they gave us some money and said, just use it in whatever way you think has the highest ROI. And we started a summer camp. And most of the famous names in behavioral economics, winners of future Nobel Prizes, are graduates of that summer camp. And 2 of the people who were at the first one, Matthew Rabin and David Leibson, have been doing it. It's still going on.
Where was the summer camp? At what level? What age level?
It was grad students. The first one was at Berkeley.
Okay.
It's moved around for a while. We were in Trento, Italy, which is impossible to get to, but people were trapped there. And yeah, it's about 35. It's really hard. It's harder to get into that than to get into Harvard or MIT PhD program. So we've gotten really good students, and we didn't make them much dumber, and they've gone off and flourished.
Wow, that's great. I didn't even know about that. Okay, great. Where are we here? What are the greatest lessons that you have passed on to your students?
Well, the finance students, I told them after DeMont and Thaler, check 6 times and get somebody else to check it. Because we had that experience of all the Chicago PhD students getting the assignment to check our work. And in finance, there's essentially no replication crisis because we're all using the same data. And, you know, if you try to fudge it, Andrea Frazzini can replicate it in 5 minutes. So yeah, be careful.
Okay, check the data.
What 3 pieces of advice would you give to students at the University of San Francisco to be successful in their business career or in their life?
All right, I'm, in the interest of time, I'll settle on 1.
Okay.
And I'm going to plagiarize myself. I was asked to give a commencement speech one year, and I told the following story. I saw an interview with Yo-Yo Ma, the world-famous cellist, who was asked, you know, how he got started. And he said that when he was about 3, he had been given a violin. And he claimed he was only an average violin player, which I think is probably false modesty. But in any case, then he said sometime around age 7, somebody gave him a cello, and then he found his calling. And so the title of my talk was Finding Your Cello. And it's not the talk that you hear at a lot of commencement speeches, which is, you know, make a goal and then go for it and you're going to succeed, which is bullshit. It's not that. But what it is find something you like. And I think the biggest mistake that students make is they choose a career based on what course they liked best. That has nothing to do necessarily with what you're going to end up doing. And, you know, I tell all my finance students, you think you're going into finance, you're actually going into marketing. So figure out, you know, especially if you're going to go to grad school, anything, law, medicine, business, find out what people who are graduates do every day. And try to imagine yourself doing that every day. And if you can't, do something else. That's my advice.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Do you think the Nobel Prize for Economics should be changed to the Nobel Prize in Social Sciences? Just because there's a lot of other social sciences that don't get the elevation, like societally, and some of the results, because we have things like, obviously, the Nobel Prize in economics, and like the Presidential Council of Economic Advisors also kind of makes it seem like economics is more important than like sociology or psychology or even linguistics or any other kind of
Okay, thank
field.
you. Thank you.
Well, it's not up to me. And as you may know, some people say that the Nobel Prize in Economics is not a real Nobel Prize, meaning it was not in Mr. Nobel's will. It was created by the Bank of Sweden. So, you know, Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize, and the committee is open to non-economists winning the prize, and non-economists are included in the people who give nominations. So I would say they're open to it, but You know, I would also say that it's not clear that having a Nobel Prize is good for economics. For every lucky person like me, there are 1,000 that are unhappy the first Monday of every October.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Min Jae Shin, and I'm a finance professional, so I just happened to join this lecture. So I do have a slightly technical question for you here. Just in the examples of failure in like the long-term capital management and like undervaluing of the risk in subprime mortgages, quant and like experts tend to fail making rational assumptions when they build their models. Where would you start like a base case scenario where you reasonably accommodate these assumptions of these failures?
I recommend the movie The Big Short.
I watched it already with you and Selena Gomez.
Yeah, that's all I'm going to say. It's too hard.
Too hard? Okay.
Next question.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for being here tonight, for giving us this talk and sharing your knowledge with us. My name is Noah Taylor. I'm a master's student in the organization development program, so not related to investing at all, but very interested in decision-making theory and behavioral economics. So my question for you, sir, is where do you see the top 3 emerging frontiers or questions that behavioral economics or decision-making theory is going to be grappling with in the future?
All right, so I'm going to cheat and give one. And I would say, I think the area of business, especially large corporations, that is most ready for a revolution is human resources. And it's because virtually no companies send their best people to human resources. And I'll give you a possibly amusing story. I'm friends with the general manager of the Philadelphia 76ers. And I invited him to speak to the top management of a large investment management company. And we had the following conversation. I said, Daryl, how many quants do you employ? He's like a pioneer in analytics in basketball. And he said 15. So he has 15 smart people doing math. And I said, Daryl, what's the size of your roster? 15. Okay, so he has 1 quant per employee that he has to hire. Then I asked the people at this company, how many employees do you have? 2,000. How many quants do you have doing human resources? 0. Now, they have quants, they have hundreds of quants as portfolio managers, but they don't have anybody as a quant picking portfolio managers. There's room for improvement there.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
That's a great point that you made. Next speaker, please.
Hi, I'm Dave Kazarowski. I'm a professor of finance here. Hey, Ludwig.
Hi.
So my question is, you give, in your prepared comments, you talk about ways that the system can be changed to nudge people into making the right decisions. Do you have any advice for us about things we can do to nudge ourselves?
Sure. I mean, all the same, we call them snudges, self-nudges. And, everybody has, if you have an alarm clock, if you have a calendar, if you have a to-do list, those are all nudges. And, my friend Terry O'Dean is here and is teaching a course in personal finance. There's lots of things that most people could do better. And
what are some of your favorites?
Well, pay attention. I mean, look, I'm supposedly an expert in finance, but I have a financial advisor, right? Partly because I'm old and I don't want to drop dead and have my family not know where things are, because I'm not that organized. But, I think we can all have, all use a little help. And I think the financial services industry, some like Vanguard, has been really good about adopting some of these basic principles, and other places are continuing to make life difficult for their customers, possibly to take advantage of them, and I disapprove of that.
Thank you.
My name is David Homa, and I teach at a local high school down in the South Bay, and I've been using your misbehaving for the last 6 years as required reading in my high school economics class.
I think I'm probably like $10 richer as a result of that. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. For more golf, I suppose.
Yeah.
But my question is, I've found over the years that the number of universities that seniors, because I teach all seniors, they keep applying to more and more and more. I'm just curious what you think, like, should they only apply to 5? Should they apply to 20? Does it matter?
I mean, we don't have time for this, but I mean, even with, the admissions process, especially at elite schools, is completely out of control.
Okay.
I mean, I have a granddaughter who went through it last year, so I've seen it firsthand. I don't think you have a choice but to apply widely. I don't have a magic bullet. The advice I gave my granddaughters, and I would give to anybody, is the differences are small, and the perceived differences are big. So don't get your heart set on one place.
Okay, I'll let them know you said that.
Yeah,
They don't listen to me.
Quote me on
Okay.
that. And there's no way they're going to figure that out based on how cute the tour guide was.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, Mrs. Taylor. Thank you much for being here. My name is Fernando. I'm a finance student here at the university. I'm a huge fan of The Big Short as well.
It's
so I have a
also
question
Lena.
for you. In your investment fund, how do you identify opportunities based on your behavioral approach?
All right. Well, I can't, reveal that. I'll just say, because we're going to run over time, but I'll say what our philosophy is. Go back to the homicides and suicides, right? So we try to find systematic mistakes that other investors make. So, you walk through a restaurant and there's somebody taking you toward your table. If there's a step like this and the restaurant's a little dark, they'll say, watch your step here. Why? They're predicting that, based on experience, this is a place where people fall down. So we're looking for stocks, we're long only, so we're looking for stocks that the market we don't think has fully appreciated and will soon, because to quote Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead. And and if you're a portfolio manager, the long run is about 2 years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Javendra Kale. I'm a professor at St. Mary's College across the bay. Our basketball team didn't do quite as well as we'd hoped, but there they are. So, Mike, I enjoyed your talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Now, it seems to me an application of what you're doing is to have irrational humans make rational decisions. So wouldn't you have to know the rational decision to do that?
Well, you can try to do better. I mean, my friend Daryl is trying to do better at forecasting which players are going to be good and which player will work on his team. And I can tell you, if you sit next to him during a game, he's got every possible, he can tell you, if that guy shoots that shot from that place unguarded, he'll make it 37% of the time, and if he's guarded 32% of the time. And You know, I think if we have smart people collecting data and using it sensibly, then we're able to make better decisions. So it's data-driven.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Professor. I'm Nitya. I'm a finance professional. So I love behavioral economics. It was one of my minors in MBA. And I heard something interesting in your talk. So you were talking about how behavioral economics is data-driven and how it's going to do good. Have you encountered a situation where whatever you studied or things that you put on a paper was used for something that was majorly messed up, or it's not in a way that you would ever condone? Can that ever happen with behavioral economics?
Well, you mean, can we do things that are mistakes? I mean, I'll give you a sort of half of an example, because I don't like admitting when I made mistakes. But here's a policy that most people think I advocate and don't. So I've told you that making signing up for the pension plan the default is a good idea, and it works. Some people advocate making signing up to being an organ donor the default. In the first version of Nudge, we made what we thought was a pretty good argument why that was a bad idea, but I don't think anybody got far enough into the book, and countries started switching to what we think is the wrong policy, including the UK, where we had explicitly decided not to do that, and the data is continuing to come in to say it's a bad idea. So why is it a bad idea? It's true that if you make it the default, virtually everyone agrees to be an organ donor because they do nothing. But that's not the problem. The problem is families. So if you have a deceased donor, very often like an accidental death, the families are asked permission. If the donor has actively chosen, the families go along with it. In the US, it's the law. It's called first-person consent. So if the donor has actively signed up, legally the family doesn't have a veto. Now, if they make a big fuss, they can get their way, but families, when they're told your loved one chose to be a donor and the law says we have to follow that, they go along with it. In the US, in the last 10 years, organ transplants, organ donations have doubled. In the UK, where they switched to what we think is the wrong model, it's been flat. So that's a nudge, a well-intended nudge that I think doesn't work.
So you definitely did not say to do that, but people interpreted it that way, and they're doing it. So another question, I think we're out of questions. My last question is related to hers. How do you feel your book got very popular? And so people are actually making policies, maybe partially due to this. How does that responsibility feel in the sense that all economists, you know, we've done it over the years, we make mistakes, even we figure them out 20 years later. How do you deal with that part of the responsibility?
So the first so-called nudge unit was in the UK, and I was going around saying we can't do evidence-based policy without evidence. So everything they did, they would try to collect data on. Now, it doesn't mean that everything you try works. In fact, most stuff you try doesn't work. Because the things that work are things like defaults, right? And I just gave an example where the default works, but it's the wrong policy. The hard problems, like, there was a question about students applying to colleges. In the first version of Nudge, which was published in 2008, we said that the financial aid, FAFSA, needs to be pre-populated. The government does that for them. They have the data. Why is this hard? Now, that was 16 years ago. And it's a current crisis because they tried to fix it and they can't. You know, I said HR is the big problem for companies. The big problem for the government is IT. How many of you are qualified as COBOL programmers? Well, then you're of no help to the government where all of the big things are COBOL. It's unbelievable. Pretty soon there will be unless ChatGPT becomes competent at COBOL programming, we're screwed. So it's hard to get our Congress to do anything, and they can't even elect speakers. But what they're really reluctant to do is spend money on boring things like infrastructure, especially if it's modern computer systems. Nobody can see, right? A new bridge, at least you can see. Upgrading the IT for some branch of government is not anything anybody will brag about, but is desperately, desperately needed. There's a book by Jen Palka called, I think, Coding for America or something like that, on this topic that I strongly recommend.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.